the woman who stepped off the southbound stage in Caldwell, Kansas, on a scorching August afternoon in 1878, carried two things that did not belong to her: a carpetbag stuffed with another woman's dresses, and a name stitched into the lining of a borrowed coat. The town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, a rough and dusty place that smelled of cattle and wood smoke, and the particular kind of desperation that settled over any settlement where men outnumbered women 4-1. It was a town of saloons and stock pens, and a single mercantile store with a porch that sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. The Kansas sun did not forgive anyone who stood too long in it, and the woman shading her eyes on the boardwalk outside the stage office looked as though the sun had already taken plenty from her. She was 23 years old, though she looked both older and younger at the same time, older around the eyes, which had seen something they were still trying to forget, and younger around the mouth, which had a softness to it that the rest of her face had not yet surrendered. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up in a practical way that still managed to be pretty. She wore a gray traveling dress that was slightly too long for her, and she kept stepping on the hem without seeming to notice. The carpetbag she carried said Dorothea Winslow on a small brass tag fastened to its handle. She was not Dorothea Winslow. She was Sallie Winslow, and the difference between those two names represented the whole catastrophe of her life. The stage driver handed down the last of the baggage and tipped his hat to no one in particular, then climbed back up to his box and was gone in a cloud of red dust before she had fully collected herself on the boardwalk. Sallie stood there with the carpetbag at her feet and a letter in her hand, the letter that had been written to her sister and had found its way to her instead, the letter that had changed everything. She read the address on the envelope one more time even though she had memorized it weeks ago. Lionel Ralston, Ralston Ranch, Caldwell, Kansas Territory. Her sister Dorothea had corresponded with this man for 4 months through a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. 4 months of careful, pretty letters written in Dorothea's looping hand, 4 months of promises and plans, and a growing warmth between two people who had never seen each other's faces. And then Dorothea had died of typhoid fever in June, quiet and fast, gone in a week, and their mother had followed her a fortnight later from grief and the same fever, and Sallie had been left alone in a boarding house in Springfield, Missouri, with $11, a dead sister's letters, and nowhere to go. She had written to Lionel Ralston herself, 2 weeks after the funerals, using Dorothea's name because she was frightened and alone and could not think of any other way to begin. She had told herself it was practical. She had told herself it was temporary, that she would explain everything when she arrived, that she would ask forgiveness in person, that any reasonable man would understand. But standing on this boardwalk now with the heat pressing down on her like a physical weight, she was not so sure that any of that was true. The stage office door opened and a man came out. He was not what she had expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, somewhere just past 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had been recently shaved, but was already making its way back toward a beard. He wore a plain canvas work shirt and suspenders over dark trousers, and he had a hat in his hands rather than on his head, which she noticed immediately because most men in this country seemed to sleep in their hats. He was turning the brim of it slowly through his fingers, a nervous gesture that he did not appear to be aware of. His eyes were the color of good creek water in summer, somewhere between green and gray, and they found her face before she had a chance to compose herself properly. "Miss Winslow," he said, and his voice was low and even, a voice that had learned to carry across open ground without shouting. "Yes," she said, and then the word felt wrong in her mouth, like a stone she had swallowed. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way men in saloon doorways looked at her, which was something she had learned to be cold against. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand carefully, honestly, without aggression. His eyes moved from her face to the carpetbag at her feet, to the letter in her hand, back to her face. He did not say anything for several seconds that felt considerably longer than they were. Then he said, What is your real name?" The question landed so cleanly, so without anger or suspicion or the theatrical edge she might have expected, that she could not find her usual defenses. Her mouth opened and no useful sound came out. "I'm not asking to embarrass you," he said. His voice was still that same quiet, carrying level. "I am asking because I would like to know what to call you. The letters you wrote to me, the last 8 of them, were written by someone different than the first 4. Not worse, not dishonest in any important way, but different. The phrasing was different. The observations were different. The sense of humor was different. And I thought, whoever this is, I would very much like to know her real name." Sallie Winslow stared at him. The Kansas sun beat down on the boardwalk. A horse at the hitching post down the street shook its head and stamped. Somewhere inside the stage office, a man was arguing about a lost trunk. She said, "Sallie, my name is Sallie Winslow. Dorothea was my sister. She died in June and she stopped. I was alone and frightened and I made a terrible decision and I am sorry for it. And if you want me to get back on the next stage, I will understand completely." Lionel Ralston looked at her for another moment. Then he did something she did not expect at all. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile that a man gives when something confirms what he already thought, and there is a quiet relief in the confirmation. "My horse is around the side," he said. "The ranch is about 6 miles east. It is too hot to stand in the street." He put his hat on his head, reached down and picked up her carpetbag before she could touch it, and walked around the corner of the stage office. She followed him, because there was nothing else to do, and because something in the way he had asked her name, not demanded, not accused, but asked, made her feel for the first time in 2 months that the world might contain more kindness than she had recently been given reason to believe. His horse was a roan gelding tied to a post behind the stage office, drinking from a trough and ignoring the world with the magnificent indifference of a well-fed animal. Beside it was a second horse, a gray mare with a white blaze already saddled. "You brought 2 horses," she said. "I figured you would need one," he said simply, and tied her carpetbag across the back of the roan's saddle. She looked at the gray mare and then at him. "You were planning to let me ride regardless." "I was planning to figure out the situation when I met you," he said. "But yes, 2 horses seemed like the right number to bring." She could not quite decide what to make of him. She accepted the help he offered to mount the mare. She was a capable rider, had grown up with horses in Missouri. But the side saddle was unfamiliar and the dress too long, and they rode out of Caldwell east into the flat golden enormity of the Kansas plains. For the first mile neither of them spoke, and strangely it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who are allowing themselves time to think before speaking, which was a rarer quality than it sounded in 1878. "How did you know," she asked finally, "about the letters? How did you know they were different people?" He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Your sister Dorothea, she wrote the way a woman writes when she is performing for an audience, not dishonestly, but carefully. She described herself in very deliberate ways, the kind of ways that tell you someone has thought hard about the impression they are making. She wrote about her love of music, her fondness for gardening. Very particular, very curated." He paused. "Your letters were different. You wrote about whether the train windows opened properly, and whether the coffee at the station in Joplin was better than anything ought to be at a railroad station. You wrote about an argument you overheard between 2 strangers and how you thought the man was wrong but felt sorry for him anyway. You described a sunset over the river and then said you felt guilty for finding it beautiful when you were so sad." Sallie said nothing for a moment. "That is a very close reading." "I had 4 months of letters," he said. "A man pays attention." She looked at the side of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the slight squint against the sun. "Were you angry when you figured it out?" "Worried," he said. "Not angry. I thought maybe something had happened to the first woman. I didn't know what I would find." He glanced at her briefly. "I am sorry about your sister and your mother." The plainness of it, the absence of ceremony around his condolence, made it more affecting than elaborate sympathy would have been. Sallie felt her throat tighten and looked out over the grass, which was tall and dry and moved in long, slow waves in the hot wind like something breathing. "She was 26, Sallie said. "Dorothea, she was kind. She was kinder than me, I think. She would not have done what I did." "She would have found herself in a different predicament," Lionel said. "Different kinds of people find different kinds of trouble. That is not a condemnation of anyone." "Does that mean you are not sending me back?" He was quiet for a moment. "Let us see how the 6 miles go," he said, and the slight dryness in his voice told her that he was not being cruel, only honest, and that honesty was simply how he was made. The 6 miles went reasonably well. By the time the Ralston ranch came into view, a white frame house, a large red barn, 2 outbuildings, a corral with a dozen horses in it, all of it sitting under a pair of enormous cottonwood trees whose shade looked like salvation in the August heat. Sallie had learned that Lionel Ralston was 31 years old, that he had come to Kansas from Tennessee with his father when he was 14, that his father had died 3 years ago and left him the ranch, that he ran cattle and a small remuda of working horses he sold to other ranchers, that he had 1 full-time hand named Curtis and 2 seasonal men who came in during cattle season, and that he had never been married. He had learned that she was 23, that she had been working as a seamstress in Springfield since she was 17, that she had finished school to the 8th grade, which was 2 grades further than most women she knew, that she had no remaining family that she was aware of, and that she had $11 in her purse, which she considered a full disclosure. $11, he said as they rode into the yard. $11, she confirmed. "That is not why I wrote to the agency," he said. "In case you were calculating." "I was not calculating," she said. "I was being honest." "I know," he said. "So was I." Curtis, the full-time hand, came out of the barn when he heard the horses. He was a small, weathered man of about 50 with a gray mustache and the cautious eyes of someone who had learned not to be surprised by anything. He looked at Sallie and then at Lionel and then at the carpetbag on the roan saddle. "This is Miss Sallie Winslow," Lionel said, swinging down from the roan. "She has come a long way." "Yes, sir," said Curtis, in a tone that conveyed he had many questions and had decided not to ask any of them, which was probably why he had worked for Lionel Ralston for 6 years. Sallie dismounted and patted the gray mare's neck and looked at the house. It was a good house. Not grand, but solid. The porch needed painting and one of the window shutters hung at a slight angle, but the overall impression was of a place that had been built carefully by someone who intended to stay. "I put fresh water in the kitchen this morning," Lionel said. "The room at the end of the hall it has been prepared." He said this last part in a way that told her he had prepared it himself, that there was no woman in the house, that he had made up a bed with clean sheets and probably changed them twice trying to get them right. She found this information unexpectedly moving. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went to help Curtis with the horses, and Sallie picked up her carpetbag and walked up the porch steps and into the house that was not hers yet and might never be. And she stood in the front room for a moment with the cool of the interior air around her, and the smell of wood and clean linen, and something that had recently been cooked with onions. And she thought, for the first time since June, that she might be all right. The first 2 weeks at the ranch were a careful and interesting negotiation. There was no question of propriety. Caldwell had a preacher, a Pastor Hendricks, who was also a justice of the peace, and Lionel had made it clear to Sallie on the first evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with coffee and a plate of corn bread he had baked himself with varying success, that the arrangement he had in mind was a proper one. He was looking for a wife. He had been looking for a wife. The matrimonial agency had been his sister's idea. His sister Pauline lived in Wichita with her husband and considered Lionel's bachelor state a personal affront, and he had been skeptical of the whole thing until the letters had begun arriving, and he had found himself increasingly impatient between them. "I want to be clear about what I am asking," he said that first evening, his coffee cup between his hands. "I'm not asking you to make a decision tonight or tomorrow or next week. I am asking you to stay long enough to make a considered one. This house needs someone who wants to be in it. I would rather wait for that than rush it." Sallie looked at him across the table. "And if I decide no, then I will give you enough money for the train fare back to wherever you would like to go, and I will speak well of you to anyone who asks, and there will be no hard feelings." He said this levelly, without any of the resentment she might have expected from a man whose plans had been altered. He seemed to mean it completely. "That is a very decent offer," she said. "I am a generally decent person," he said, without any particular pride. "At least I try to be." She smiled, and it was the first full smile she had given anyone in 2 months, and he saw it, and something in his expression shifted, very slightly, like a door opening a crack to let in light. In those first 2 weeks she learned the rhythms of the ranch. She woke early, because the ranch woke early, and she cooked breakfast for Lionel and Curtis, which they both accepted with the gratitude of men who had been cooking for themselves and knew they were not good at it. She was a good cook, had learned from necessity in the Springfield boarding house, and the improvement in the quality of breakfast was apparently something both men found enormously significant. Curtis said nothing about it directly, but began arriving at the kitchen door with hat in hand rather than walking straight through, which she understood to be a form of compliment. She mended things. The ranch had a considerable backlog of mending shirts with missing buttons, trousers with worn knees, a quilt in the parlor that was coming apart at several seams. She worked through the pile methodically and without comment, because the work was familiar and comforting, and because she needed something to do with her hands while she was still figuring out where she was. She also helped in the barn when she could be useful, which surprised Curtis and did not seem to surprise Lionel at all. She had grown up with animals. She knew how to handle a horse, could carry feed without being told where to put it, and had a natural ease around livestock that came from actual experience rather than bravado. The horses in the corral seemed to agree with her presence. The big sorrel stallion that Lionel was working to gentle had bitten Curtis twice in the past month and stood quietly while Sallie offered it a handful of dried grass and breathed slowly near its nose. "He does not bite women," Curtis observed. "He bites anyone who is nervous," Sallie said. "I am not nervous." Lionel was watching from the fence. "You are not nervous very often," he said. "I have noticed that." "I am nervous sometimes," she said. "I'm just quiet about it." "So am I," he said, and they looked at each other over the fence rail in the warm morning air, and something that had been growing very carefully between them since the boardwalk in Caldwell put down another inch of root. On the 16th day, something happened that changed the temperature of things between them. Sallie had ridden out in the early afternoon to bring lunch to Lionel and Curtis, who were working the south pasture fence line. The plains were open and golden in August, the grass tall, the sky enormous and blue-white with heat. She knew the way now, had ridden it twice before. She was not paying as careful attention as she should have been, which was her own fault, and when the gray mare shied at a snake crossing the trail, Sallie was not seated firmly enough to stay on. She came off in a graceless and painful way and landed hard on her left side in the dry grass. She was not badly hurt. The wind was knocked out of her, and her left arm was scraped raw from elbow to wrist, and she was thoroughly embarrassed, but nothing was broken. She lay in the grass for a moment looking up at the enormous Kansas sky, listening to the mare stand nervously nearby, and thought that the situation had dignity, but not very much of it. She heard hoofbeats and then Lionel's voice, and then he was beside her, down from his horse and kneeling in the grass, and his hands were on her shoulders in a way that was careful and urgent all at the same time. "Are you hurt?" he said. "My arm," she said, "and my dignity." He helped her sit up and looked at her arm with an expression of focused concern, turning her wrist gently to see the extent of the scrape. His hands were large and calloused but careful, and the touch was so evidently not performing anything that she felt the full warmth of it without any of the awkwardness she might have anticipated. "That needs cleaning," he said. "Nothing broken." "I know nothing is broken," she said. "I know the difference." "I expect you do." He helped her to her feet. She was a little unsteady and his hand stayed at her elbow, and for a moment they were standing very close together in the middle of the Kansas plain with nothing in any direction for miles, and the afternoon heat was pressing in around them, and she was suddenly very aware of the exact quality of his attention. "The lunch is probably fine," she said. "It was in the bag. The bag did not fall off." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between amusement and something considerably more serious. "I am not thinking about the lunch," he said. She looked up at him. "What are you thinking about?" He seemed to consider whether to answer. Then he said quietly, "That I am very glad you are not more hurt, and that I have been trying to be appropriately patient, and I find it is becoming more difficult." She understood what he meant. She felt the same thing, had felt it growing for 2 weeks, this increasingly hard-to-ignore pull toward a person who had turned out to be something she had not expected when she climbed off that stage. She had expected a stranger, a transaction, a practical arrangement. She had found instead a man who paid close attention and meant what he said and had brought 2 horses to the stage office because he thought she might need one. "Lionel," she said. "Sallie," he said, and he said her real name with the same care he had used when he first asked it, and it felt like being recognized. She reached up with her uninjured arm and took his hand off her elbow and held it. Just that. His fingers closed around hers carefully, as though she were something he did not want to disturb. "I have not decided nothing," she said. "I was just pretending to still be deciding." The corner of his mouth moved. "How long have you known?" "About a week," she honestly admitted. "Maybe 10 days. I have known since the second day," he said. She laughed, and it surprised her, the ease of it, the way a laugh could come out of a person who had spent 2 months in the heaviest grief. "You could have said something." "You needed time," he said, "and I needed to be sure." "And now you are sure?" "Yes," he said simply. Curtis arrived from the south fence line at a trot, his face creased with concern, and found them standing in the grass holding hands. He looked at Lionel's face and then at Sally's arm and said, "She fall off." "She did," Lionel said. "Happened to anyone," Curtis said, with the magnanimity of a man who had fallen off considerably more times than anyone needed to know. He retrieved the gray mare from where she was grazing 20 feet away and brought her back, and neither of them said another word about what Curtis had just witnessed, because it was perfectly clear. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, Sally's arm wrapped in a clean handkerchief from Lionel's pocket, and the world seemed to have developed a quality of lightness that Sallie had not expected to find in Kansas. Over the following weeks, the ranch settled into a new kind of order, one that had a different energy to it, warmer and more deliberate. Lionel had gone to see Pastor Hendricks a few days after the afternoon in the south pasture, and had apparently spoken to him at some length, because the pastor appeared at the ranch the following Sunday with his wife and stayed for dinner, and was extremely charming to Sallie in the way that men of the cloth are charming to women they are vetting for someone they like. "Are you a woman of faith, Miss Winslow?" Pastor Hendricks asked, over plates of roasted chicken that Sallie had cooked, and that Lionel was eating with the focused appreciation of a man who had lived too long on his own cooking. "I am a woman who has had some difficult conversations with God recently," Sallie said honestly. "We are still working things out between us." Pastor Hendricks laughed, which she had not expected. He was a small, round man with kind eyes behind round spectacles, and his laugh was genuine. "That is the most honest answer I have had to that question in 15 years of asking it," he said. His wife, a thin, bright-eyed woman named Martha, who had clearly formed her own opinion about Sallie within the first 20 minutes and found it favorable, said, "I told you she was different, Henry," which was somehow both slightly embarrassing and deeply pleasing. After the Hendrickses left in their buggy in the golden late afternoon light, Lionel and Sallie sat on the porch steps in the cooling air and listened to the cottonwood leaves, which had a sound like distant rain, and Lionel said without looking at her, "I should ask you properly." She turned her head to look at him. He was still looking at the road where the Hendricks' buggy had disappeared. "I should do it right," he said, "especially given how everything started. I want it to be right." "Everything started with me lying to you," she said. "Everything started with a woman alone in the world making the best decision available to her," he said firmly. "I do not count that against you. I want that to be clear." "It is clear," she said softly. He looked at her then. The evening light was on his face, and in it he looked serious and open in equal measure, a man who had decided something and was committing to the decision with everything he had. He was not a man who did things halfway. She had understood this about him within the first week. "Sallie Winslow," he said, "will you marry me? Not because of any arrangement or any letter or anything that happened before you stepped off that stage, but because of the last 3 weeks, and because I believe we are well suited in the ways that matter most, and because I would like very much to spend the rest of my life knowing what you think about sunsets and bad coffee and the arguments of strangers." She felt her eyes sting, which annoyed her because she was not generally a woman who cried at things, and she blinked it back and said, "Yes, Lionel Ralston. That is exactly what I would like too." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they sat on the porch steps as the Kansas evening came on, slowly, in shades of orange and purple, and the cottonwood trees made their rain sound overhead, and somewhere across the plains a nighthawk called, and Sallie thought about Dorothea, about how her sister had wanted this man and this life, and she felt both the sorrow of it and something else, a sense that perhaps Dorothea, wherever she was, might not find anything to be angry about in how this had turned out. They married on the first Saturday of September, 1878, in the little white church in Caldwell that leaned very slightly north in the Kansas wind, as though perpetually listening for something. The day was clear, and the temperature had dropped to something almost kind, the first suggestion of autumn in the air, and Sallie wore a dress she had made herself in the 2 weeks before the wedding from blue wool she had bought at the Caldwell Mercantile. A good solid blue that was not the blue of a formal occasion, but was deeply pleasing and suited her coloring in a way she had noted with private satisfaction. Curtis attended, in a suit that had been cleaned within an inch of its life, and which he wore with the expression of a man performing a necessary but uncomfortable duty. Martha Hendricks cried, which no one had asked her to do, but which everyone found appropriate. A rancher named Albrecht and his wife who lived 8 miles north attended because Lionel had ridden out to tell them, and Mrs. Albrecht had exclaimed loud enough to be heard from the yard. Lionel wore a dark coat and a white shirt and his good hat, and when Sallie walked down the short aisle toward him, he watched her coming with an expression of such uncomplicated gladness that she had to take a deliberate breath to keep the stinging out of her eyes again. The vows they said to each other were the standard ones, the words that had been said in that church many times before and would be said many times again, but Sallie felt the specific weight of each one, especially when she said her own real name, Sallie Winslow, before it became Sallie Ralston. Outside the church afterward, in the September sunlight, Curtis shook Lionel's hand and then turned to Sallie and shook hers too, which was unusual, and which she understood to be the highest compliment he could offer. Mrs. Albrecht embraced her and said, "You will do wonderfully, dear. Any woman who can make a dress like that in 2 weeks is capable of anything," and Sallie laughed and thanked her. Lionel held her hand all the way back to the ranch in the wagon, and did not let go of it even when he needed both hands to manage the reins, which required a certain creative renegotiation of the situation that made both of them laugh. The ranch was theirs now, fully and finally, and Sallie felt the rightness of it in her bones, not the rightness of something that had gone to plan, because nothing about this had gone to plan, but the rightness of something that had arrived at the right place by a strange road. The autumn came on fast in Kansas, the way it always did, and the work of the ranch shifted its nature. The cattle needed moving, the horses needed winterizing, the house needed preparing for the cold that would come sweeping down off the northern plains in November without much warning. Sallie threw herself into all of it with a wholeheartedness that surprised even her. She had always been capable. She knew that about herself, had had to be capable from the time she was very young, had learned early that no one was going to solve the problems that were hers to solve. But there was a difference between being capable out of necessity and being capable in a context where that capability was appreciated and useful and part of something larger than herself, and she was discovering that difference now. Lionel watched her learn the ranch with the same close attention he gave to everything, and she could feel that attention without it being oppressive, which was a distinction she valued highly. He did not tell her how to do things unless she asked. He did not correct her in front of Curtis. He asked her opinion on decisions about the ranch as though her opinion were genuinely wanted, which it was, and she gave it directly, and he listened. They had a disagreement in October about whether to sell 4 of the horses to a buyer from Dodge City who Lionel felt was offering a fair price, and Sallie felt was offering a price that understood they needed to sell more than he needed to buy. She said so plainly. Lionel thought about it for 2 days, and then went back to the buyer from Dodge City and negotiated a higher price, and came home and told her what he had gotten for them, and she said, "That is much better," and he said, "Yes, you were right," without any qualification or ceremony about it, and she felt the remarkable cleanness of being with a person who was not troubled by being wrong. She also met in October 2 people who would become important to her. The first was Pauline, Lionel's sister, who arrived from Wichita on the 3rd Saturday of October with her husband Gerald and their 2 children, aged 5 and 7, in a state of barely contained excitement. Pauline was 3 years older than Lionel, brisk and quick and affectionate, with the same Creekwater eyes as her brother but deployed at a considerably higher velocity. She embraced Sallie within 30 seconds of arrival, which was startling, and then stood back and looked at her with enormous directness and said, "You are not at all what I expected." "I know," Sallie said. "It is a long story." "I want to hear every word of it," Pauline said, and she meant it completely. They sat in the kitchen for 3 hours that afternoon, Pauline and Sallie and cups of good coffee, while Gerald and Lionel went out to look at the horses, and the children ran around the yard being supervised in theory by Curtis, who had strong opinions about children and kept them entirely to himself. And Sallie told Pauline the real story: Dorothea, the fever, the letters, the carpetbag with the wrong name on it, the boardwalk in Caldwell, and the man who had asked her real name instead of the one she was wearing. Pauline was quiet through most of it, which was not her natural state, and when Sallie finished, she sat for a moment with her coffee cup in both hands and then said, "I am very sorry about your sister. And your mother." "Thank you," Sallie said. "And I want to be clear," Pauline said, "that my brother would have fallen in love with you through those letters regardless. He told me, when he wrote to tell me he was going to meet the stage, that whoever had written the last 8 letters was someone he very much wanted to know. He did not know, then, that you were different from the first woman. He only knew that whoever you were, you wrote as though you were actually paying attention to the world." Sallie looked at her coffee cup. "He told me something similar. He is a man of few exaggerations," Pauline said, "which means when he says something, it is exactly as true as it sounds." The second person Sallie met in October was a woman named Anita Morales, who lived with her husband and 3 children on a small farm 6 miles south of the Ralston ranch. Anita was compact and fierce and funny, 30 years old, with black hair and quick dark eyes, and an iron practicality about the business of living that Sallie immediately recognized as a kindred quality. Her husband Roberto worked with Lionel occasionally during cattle season, and was a careful, solid man who clearly found Anita the most interesting person in any room, which Sallie also recognized as a good sign in a husband. The 2 women began visiting each other regularly, swapping preserves and recipes, and the kind of honest talk that women on the frontier exchanged like currency, because it was that valuable. Anita had been in Kansas for 5 years and knew things about surviving the winters and the isolation and the particular difficulties of being a woman in a territory that was still working out its own rules, and she gave Sallie this knowledge without condescension, as between equals. "The loneliness is the hardest part," Anita said one afternoon in November, over Sallie's kitchen table. "Not always. But in February, when the snow comes and the sky is the same color for days and you cannot get out to see anyone, that is the hardest. I grew up in Missouri," Sallie said. "I know cold." "Kansas cold is different," Anita said. "It is personal," Sallie laughed. "How do you manage it?" "Roberto," Anita said plainly, "and my children, and knowing that March comes eventually, and I make things. I always have something I am making." She looked at Sallie's mending basket, which was permanently full. "You are the same. You will be all right." The first real snow came in November, a week earlier than Lionel had expected, and buried the yard a foot deep overnight. Sallie stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and watched the white world outside and thought of Anita's words and thought of February still coming. And then she turned back to the kitchen and put more wood on the fire and started breakfast. And Lionel came in from checking the animals with cold on his coat and snow in his hair, and she handed him a cup of coffee without being asked, and he said, "Good morning, Sallie Ralston," with such straightforward warmth that the February she had not yet reached seemed much less formidable. Through the long winter they were almost always together. The small distances between people on a ranch in January, the distance between the house and the barn, between waking and the fire, between work and rest, became the whole territory of their world, and they moved through it with increasing ease and increasing closeness, the kind of closeness that develops between people who have no social occasion to perform for, no audience to consider, only each other in the firelight on evenings when the wind came off the plains like a judgment. They talked. This was the thing Sallie had not anticipated, not the affection which she had hoped for, not the physical comfort of another person close in the cold, which she had expected to value, but the talking. Lionel Ralston talked to her as though she were a full-sized person with a full-sized mind, which sounds like a low bar but was, in 1878 in Kansas, in fact a fairly high one. He asked her opinions and took the answers seriously. He told her things about the ranch and his plans for it, and expected her to engage with them as a partner. He told her, one February evening, about the first cattle drive he had been on as a boy of 16, just him and his father and 2 hired men on the trail north from Texas, and about the moment on the Red River crossing when he had understood for the first time that the world was both beautiful and indifferent, and that a man had to choose what to do with that information. "What did you choose?" she asked. They were sitting on opposite ends of the sofa with a fire going and the wind somewhere outside being geographical. "I chose to pay attention," he said. "That was the only thing I could think of that seemed adequate." She looked at him, this man who had paid enough attention to notice that 8 letters were written by a different hand than the first 4, who had brought 2 horses to the stage office, who had asked her real name instead of the borrowed one. "I think it was the right choice," she said. "I think so too," he said, and reached over and took her hand the way he had in the south pasture in August, carefully, as though she were worth being careful with. She told him things in return. About her mother, who had been both difficult and brave. About the boarding house in Springfield and the small economies of a life on not quite enough money. About Dorothea, who had been better at most social graces but had a fear of horses that she kept secret, and which Sallie had never told anyone until now. About the 4 months when Dorothea had been writing to Lionel and had shown Sallie the letters and been in the way of older sisters, both proud of them and slightly proprietary about them, and how Sallie had read them and thought, "This man sounds real." "You thought I sounded real," he said. "Most of the men in those agencies do not sound real," she said. "They sound like what they think a woman wants to read. You sounded like a person who was actually writing a letter to another person." "I was trying to do exactly that," he said. "I know," she said. That is why I wrote back. They were, by February, deeply and unceremoniously in love, which is to say the kind of love that does not announce itself loudly, but is present in every ordinary moment. In the way he always left her coffee on the right side of the stove where she could reach it. In the way she always knew when he had had a difficult day with the horses before he said anything. In the way they made decisions together as though there were never any question about whose decision it was, because it was always both of theirs. Pauline wrote in February with the news that she was expecting a third child, and her letter was full of the particular exhausted joy of a woman who has done this before and knows what is coming. Sallie wrote back with recipes for ginger tea and the kind of frank practical advice that Pauline had specifically requested, and tucked into the letter a small embroidered handkerchief she had made on a slow afternoon, and Pauline wrote back to say it was the prettiest thing she had received since her wedding. Curtis managed the snow and the cold with the stoic competence of a man who had been doing it for years and had no interest in complaining about anything. But Sallie noticed in January that he had developed a cough that he was trying to pretend did not exist. And she made him a series of increasingly targeted remedies from the things she had in the kitchen, honey and lemon, and dried herbs she had brought from Springfield, because a boarding-house seamstress learned to be a practical herbalist. And by the first week of February, the cough was largely gone, and Curtis had started bringing her firewood without being asked, which was his version of an emotional declaration. The winter broke finally in late March, the way it does on the Kansas plains, not gradually but all at once, as though a decision had been made at a high administrative level and implemented immediately. The snow went in 3 days, the mud came for 2 weeks, and then the grass came back, the birds came back. The world was green and enormous and full of the particular optimism of spring on the frontier. Sallie stood in the yard on a morning in early April and watched the horses in the corral, and felt the sun on her face, and thought about the August morning when she had stepped off the stage in Caldwell, tired and frightened, and wearing the wrong name like a wrong coat. She thought about how far she had come from that morning, not in distance. She was 6 miles east of where she had stood, but in everything else. She did not feel guilty about Dorothea anymore. She had worked through that feeling over the winter, in the honest and slightly painful way she did most things, and had arrived at a place that was not indifference to her sister's memory, but was something more like acceptance. Dorothea had wanted this man and this life. She had not got to have them. That was a tragedy, and Sallie held it as one. But Sallie was here, and the life was here, and the man was here, and they were hers, genuinely hers, earned by honesty and work and the gradual unfolding of 2 people into each other's trust, and she was not going to apologize for being alive. She heard the screen door and Lionel came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her, and she took the cup he offered without looking at him, because she was still looking at the horses, and they stood there in the April morning for a long, quiet time. "Good spring," he said. "Good spring," she agreed. Later that April, a situation arose that neither of them had anticipated. A man arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning and said his name was Edward Greer, and that he was a land agent representing an Eastern investment company, and that the company was interested in purchasing several adjoining properties in the eastern portion of Sumner County for a proposed cattle operation of some considerable scale. He was well dressed for Kansas, in the particular overdressed way of men who come from cities to the frontier, and have not yet understood that no one is impressed, and he had the smooth manner of a person who has made a profession of pleasant insincerity. Lionel listened to him from the porch steps with no expression on his face at all, which Sallie had learned was a specific kind of attention. "We would offer a very fair price for the Ralston acreage," Greer said, "considerably above the current assessed value." "No," Lionel said. "I wonder if you have considered—" "I have considered it for the time it took you to explain it," Lionel said. "The answer is no. This ranch is not for sale." Greer smiled in the patient way of a man who believes resistance is just a preliminary stage of negotiation. Perhaps if your wife— My wife agrees with me, Lionel said. I do, Sallie said from the doorway, where she had been standing for the past 5 minutes with a dish towel over her arm, listening. Greer looked at her and then back at Lionel and recalibrated. He tried 3 more angles over the next 10 minutes, each one meeting the same quiet, complete refusal, and then left in his hired buggy in the direction of the Albrecht farm 8 miles north, and Lionel watched him go. He will try the Albrechts, Sallie said. He will, Lionel agreed. I should ride over and warn them. We should ride over, she said. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved. We should ride over, he agreed. They rode to the Albrecht farm and told them about Greer, and the Albrechts, who had been on their land for 11 years and had buried a child in it and were not going anywhere, received this information with a fortified calm. Mrs. Albrecht made coffee and said that if Mr. Greer came to her door she would send him away so thoroughly he would need directions back to his own hat. Lionel and Mr. Albrecht talked for an hour about the general problem of Eastern capital making plays for frontier land, which was not a new problem in 1878, but was becoming a more organized one. On the way home, riding through the spring afternoon with the new grass bright and the sky high and clear, Sallie said, "Can they actually make you sell the company?" "No," Lionel said, "not without a legal process that would take years and that we would win. The land is clear-titled. My father was particular about that." He paused. "They will try the pressure of neighbors, though. If they get enough of the surrounding land, the access roads become complicated. But the Albrechts will not sell." "No," he said. "And I do not believe the Morales family will either." "I will ask Anita," Sallie said. She did ask Anita the following day, and Anita confirmed this with a brevity and a look in her eye that suggested the conversation with Mr. Greer, should he visit, would be more direct than Mrs. Albrecht's, which was saying something. The Eastern Investment Company, deprived of the key parcels it needed, eventually directed its attentions to a different part of the county, and Greer's visits to the Caldwell area ceased. The spring and summer of 1879 were good months. Lionel sold a string of horses to the Army post at Fort Dodge, a transaction that had taken several months of correspondence and represented a significant income for the ranch. The horses were excellent, Lionel bred carefully and trained with real skill, and the Army buyer came in person to look at them and left satisfied. Curtis was there for the whole business and was afterward in a mood of quiet satisfaction that lasted for weeks. In June, a year almost to the month since Sallie had last been in Springfield, she received a letter from a woman named Ida Pierce, who had been the proprietress of the boarding house where Sallie and Dorothea had lived. Ida wrote to say that she had come across a box of belongings left behind when Sallie had gone, some books, some smaller items, a framed photograph that she thought Sallie would want back. She offered to send them. Sallie wrote back immediately and said please, yes, and included the money for the postage. And 3 weeks later a small parcel arrived with a note from Ida, and inside the parcel was the photograph. It was of Sallie and Dorothea, taken in Springfield 2 years before, at a photographer's studio that Dorothea had saved up for. Dorothea was seated, and Sallie was standing beside her with her hand on her sister's shoulder, and they were both looking directly at the camera with the particular expression of people who have been told to look serious for a photograph, and have instead arrived at an expression somewhere between solemn and trying not to laugh. Dorothea had dark hair like Sallie's and the same shape of jaw, but a lighter quality to her face, something more openly hopeful. Sallie sat with the photograph for a long time at the kitchen table. Lionel came in and she showed it to him. He sat down across from her and looked at it seriously and then said, "She looks kind." "She was," Sallie said. "She looks like you," he said. "People said so," Sallie said. "We did not think so ourselves." He looked at the photograph a moment longer and then back at Sallie. "She would have liked knowing you were all right," he said. "I believe that," Sallie nodded. She believed it too. She found a frame for the photograph in one of the small jobs that needed doing around the house and put it on the mantelpiece, and it stayed there. That summer, Sallie discovered she was expecting a child. She was not entirely surprised, but the certainty of it when it came had a weight to it that was both remarkable and slightly terrifying in the way that all things of real consequence are slightly terrifying. She told Lionel on a warm July evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, and his reaction was the one she had not known she needed until she saw it, not elaborate celebration, not performance, but a stillness that was fuller than most expressions, and his hand covering hers on the porch rail, and him saying her name quietly and then not saying anything else for a moment because he was taking the magnitude of it in. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "Good," he said. And then, after a pause, "Good." She laughed at the repetition of it, and he laughed too, and the laughter was the kind that comes from a deep place, the kind that is partly relief and partly joy, and partly the simple, overwhelming truth that life continues to happen and insists on being felt. She wrote to Pauline, who responded with a letter of such enthusiastic warmth that it took 3 pages and still seemed not to have run out of things to say. Pauline's 3rd child had been born in April, a boy named Thomas, and she wrote about motherhood with the authority of someone who was currently covered in it, and found it both harder and more astonishing than she had expected. Sallie told Anita in person, on one of their regular visits, and Anita took her hands and looked at her with a directness that was neither congratulatory performance nor hollow comfort, but real human recognition. "The first one is the hardest," Anita said. "Not the birth necessarily, though that too. The first year, but you will not be alone. I will be here." "I know," Sallie said, and she did know, which made everything more possible. The pregnancy moved through the summer and into the autumn with reasonable kindness. Sallie was not sick in the particular miserable way she had been warned about, only occasionally and manageably. She tired more easily toward the end of summer, and Lionel adapted to this without comment or fuss, redistributing what could be redistributed, and simply doing more of everything else himself. Curtis also somehow managed to have more time for the things around the house that normally needed Sallie's attention. In the discreet way, he managed most things he felt strongly about. The calf came in October, the baby, she corrected herself, starting to say it differently in her mind in preparation. And it was a good October, the golden light and cooling air that Kansas offered in its best seasons as a partial apology for everything else. Sallie felt the rightness of this timing. A child born in the spring of 1880 would come into a world that was warming, that had light and open air, that was showing its better face. Her labor began on a night in late March, the kind of mild weather that comes to Kansas in the early spring like a promise that might or might not be kept. Anita was there, had come 2 days before and was sleeping in the guest room just in case, and she was calm and practical, and everything a woman could want beside her in that particular and unmerciful experience. Lionel was in the house and not in the house, relegated to the kitchen by Anita's firm instruction and the general custom of the time, and Sallie could hear him moving around in there, the sound of him existing close by, which was its own kind of comfort. The baby arrived in the early morning hours, loud and immediate about his feelings on the subject, a boy, sound and furious and entirely himself. Sallie held him and looked at his red, wrinkled face and the shock of it, the reality of him, the specific particularity of this one person who had not existed in the world 12 hours ago, was unlike anything she had experienced. A door opening on a room she had not known was there. When Lionel came in, he stopped at the bedside and looked at his son and then at Sallie with an expression that she would think about for the rest of her life, something that had moved entirely beyond words, the face of a man who has just understood something he cannot explain but will spend the rest of his life being shaped by. "Hello," he said to the baby. The baby squeezed his eyes shut and yawned enormously, indifferent to the occasion. "He looks like you," Sallie said. "He looks like a turnip," Lionel said, and she laughed and immediately regretted the laughing, and he took her hand and she squeezed it hard and he let her. They named him James, Thomas Ralston James, for Lionel's father, Thomas as a nod to Pauline's newest, which delighted Pauline beyond all reasonable measure when they wrote to tell her. Pauline descended on the ranch with Gerald and all 3 children 3 weeks after the birth and was overwhelming in her love for the baby and for Sallie and for the whole situation, which she had largely claimed credit for engineering, which was not entirely untrue. Curtis, when Lionel brought the baby out to show him for the first time on a mild April afternoon, looked at James Thomas Ralston for a long and silent moment and then said, "Good size," which was the highest praise available to him and which everyone understood perfectly. The years settled in after that with a fullness that was not easy. Nothing on the frontier was easy, especially not with a child, and then, by the spring of 1882, a second child, a girl they named Eleanor after Sallie's grandmother, but was deeply, foundationally good in the way that only things built on honest ground can be good. The ranch grew. Lionel added acreage on the north side in 1881, bought from a homesteader who had decided Kansas was not for him and needed to be elsewhere quickly. The horse program grew too, Lionel's reputation for good working horses spreading through the region in the steady way of genuine quality, not flash but reliability. Sallie expanded the kitchen garden into something considerably more ambitious. A large kitchen and cutting garden that fed the household through most of the summer and well into autumn, and produced preserves in quantities that she traded and gifted through the community with the same easy directness she gave to everything. She was known in the area around Caldwell as a woman of substantial capability and considerable honesty, and a humor that made itself felt without being performed, and she valued this reputation more than almost any other recognition she could have imagined. She also began, in the winter of 1881, to teach. This was Anita's idea initially, or rather Anita's observation, that there were children on the surrounding farms and ranches who had no school to attend, the nearest being in Caldwell 6 miles away, and that the winter months when travel was difficult were the months when children fell furthest behind, and that Sallie, who had her 8th grade education and her natural inclination toward organized thought, was the obvious solution to this problem. "I am not a trained teacher," Sallie said. "You are the most educated woman within 8 miles, Anita said. "That is what training looks like out here." She taught in her own front room through the winter, 3 mornings a week, a shifting group of children between 6 and 12 who came when weather and farm work permitted. She taught reading and arithmetic and some basic geography, and she taught it with the same directness and honesty she brought to everything, without condescension and without impatience, and the children responded to it with the enthusiasm of people to whom information is a genuine and novel resource. James came to the lessons when he was old enough, sitting in the back with the older children and taking in everything with Lionel's close attention, and Sallie's quick mind deployed together in a face that was becoming more his own every month. Eleanor came to the lessons, and was immediately and transparently the most demanding student anyone had ever seen, with opinions about the curriculum at age 3 that she expressed with complete conviction. Lionel attended one lesson on a January morning when the weather made outdoor work impossible, and sat in the corner with a cup of coffee and watched his wife teach for an hour with an expression that was private but legible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. After the children had gone home, he said, "You are very good at this." "I had a good example," she said, stacking the papers she had been using. "Who?" "My mother," she said. She was not always easy to live with, but she knew how to explain things. "I would have liked to meet her," he said. Sallie was quiet for a moment. "She would have been difficult to you at first," she said honestly. "She was difficult to everyone at first, but she would have come around. She appreciated people who meant what they said. Then we would have gotten along eventually," he said. "You would have," she agreed. The teaching continued through several winters, and eventually, in 1884, Sumner County established a proper school district and hired a young woman from Topeka who had a real teacher's certificate, and Sallie's informal winter school was folded into the new structure. Sallie helped the new teacher, Miss Evelyn Marsh, get settled, shared everything she had learned about teaching, in particular the specific children in the area and their particular difficulties and strengths, and was entirely gracious about the transition, which Miss Marsh recognized and appreciated with a genuine warmth. In the summer of 1883, an event occurred that had nothing to do with the romance of the story and everything to do with the justice of it. The Eastern Investment Company that had sent Edward Greer around Sumner County in 1879 had not, it turned out, given up its ambitions for the region. It had simply taken a longer approach, working through legal manipulations of water rights and road access that were technically within the law and morally bankrupt, the kind of operations that Eastern capital routinely conducted against frontier families who did not have the resources to fight back through the same legal channels. Roberto Morales came to Lionel in August with a document he had received claiming that the access road that crossed the corner of a neighboring property to reach the Morales farm had been purchased by a subsidiary company, and that the Morales family would be required to pay for access or find another route, the other route being across ground that flooded in spring and was impassable half the year. Lionel read the document and then read it again, and then took it to Caldwell, and found a lawyer named Beaumont who had an office on the main street and a reputation for being one of the few genuinely honest legal practitioners in the county. Beaumont read the document and said that the claim was questionable and would require a challenge in the county court and would probably take 6 months and cost money that Roberto and Anita Morales did not easily have. Sallie, when Lionel brought all of this home and laid it out on the kitchen table, said, "We pay for it." Lionel looked at her. "We have the money," she said. "The horse sale in the spring. We can cover the legal costs." She paused. "And I imagine the Albrechts would contribute something. And others if we ask. It will take time," he said. "Anita has been here for 5 years and has buried one child in this ground and built that farm with her own hands and Roberto's," Sallie said. "We do not leave them to fight that alone." He was looking at her with that expression she knew well by now, the one that was not surprise exactly but was something like recognition renewed, as though he was being reminded of something about her that he already knew but that still struck him fresh. "No," he said, "we do not." They rallied the community with the same quiet effectiveness they brought to most things, not loudly, not with drama, but directly and personally, riding out to the Albrechts and the other families within reach, explaining the situation plainly, asking for what help people could give. The response was sufficient, not overwhelming but real. Frontier communities had a complex relationship with their own members, could be provincial and prejudiced in ways that bore the stain of the era, but could also close ranks against an external threat with a solidarity born of knowing what isolation felt like and what it cost to face it alone. The Morales legal case proceeded through the fall and winter and was resolved in the spring of 1884 in the Morales family's favor, Beaumont having found a flaw in the subsidiary company's chain of title that unraveled the whole claim. The company did not pursue further action in the county after that, having found the investment of continued effort unequal to the return. Anita came to the ranch the day after the decision and brought 3 jars of the best preserves she made, which were remarkable, and sat at Sallie's kitchen table and cried, very quietly, for about 30 seconds, and then stopped and drank her coffee and was entirely Anita again. But those 30 seconds were the only time in 5 years of friendship that Sallie had seen her cry, and she understood the full weight of what they represented. "It is your ranch too," Sallie said. "We protect what is ours." "I am going to name the next one Sallie," Anita said. "You should name the next one whatever she wants to be called when she gets here," Sallie said, and Anita laughed and said, "That is fair." And the next Morales baby, born in 1885, was indeed a girl and was named Catalina, which Anita said the baby had clearly insisted upon even before she arrived, and which seemed right. The summer of 1884 was the summer that James Ralston turned 4 and became, in Curtis's resigned judgment, capable of getting into any situation on the ranch that was not actively bolted shut, and several that were. He had Lionel's physical confidence and Sallie's complete fearlessness about new things, deployed together in a body that was still small enough to fit through gaps that should not have been gaps, and the result was an ongoing negotiation between his curiosity and the ranch's structural integrity. Eleanor, at 2, observed all of this with the cool scientific interest of a child who is taking notes. Lionel taught James to sit a horse that summer, or began the process, which was an extended and earnest enterprise that involved a very patient pony borrowed from the Albrechts and a great deal of mutual respect building between boy and animal. Sallie watched from the fence on the first day and felt something that was not quite any single emotion, but was made of many of them simultaneously: pride and tenderness and a quiet astonishment at the trajectory of a life, at how far this moment was from the boarding house in Springfield and how naturally it had arrived. "He is not afraid," Lionel said, coming to stand beside her at the fence. "No," she said, "he would not be." "Where did he get that?" Lionel said with a slight dryness. She looked at him. "From you, I think." "From both of us," he said, and put his arm around her shoulders, and they watched their son and the borrowed pony negotiate the terms of their relationship in the August heat. Curtis retired from full-time work at the end of 1884. He was 62, and his back had begun to register its objections to ranch work in increasingly decisive terms, and Lionel had spent several months finding a situation for him that was acceptable to his dignity, which was considerable if understated. He went to work for the Caldwell livery stable as a senior hand, work that was lighter and within a town rather than the open range, and he came to Sunday dinner at the Ralston Ranch at least twice a month for years afterward, appearing at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands, and whatever was in season from the small kitchen garden he maintained behind his rented room. A new full-time hand named Wilson came to the ranch in January of 1885, a young man of 22 from Arkansas, earnest and capable, and with the particular quality of someone who had been raised right and knew how to learn. Lionel evaluated people quickly and accurately, and Wilson proved out what Lionel had seen in him within the first month. He was not Curtis. No one would be Curtis, but he was good, and he treated Sallie with respect and the children with a careful attention that she noted and appreciated. Pauline and Gerald visited in the summer of 1885 with their 3 children. The oldest was now 12 and already had opinions about horses that he expressed at length, and the house was full for a week in a way that was both overwhelming and wonderful. Sallie and Pauline stayed up too late on 2 evenings talking on the porch while the husbands were inside playing cards with Gerald's insufficient poker face, and on the second evening Pauline said, with a directness that was her natural mode, "Are you happy, genuinely?" "Yes," Sallie said, "genuinely." "I knew you would be," Pauline said. "I did not know it was you I was helping arrange, but whoever it was, I knew he needed someone real." She paused. "He spent a long time not finding real." "He found it in a roundabout way," Sallie said. "The best ones do," Pauline said, and raised her coffee cup in a small gesture of toast, and Sallie raised hers, and the cottonwood trees made their rain sound over the porch, and the Kansas night was soft and full of stars. On a morning in September of 1885, Sallie sat down at the kitchen table with her good pen and a clean sheet of paper, and began to write a letter to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis through which Lionel had first corresponded with Dorothea. She had been thinking about doing this for over a year. She wrote carefully and specifically, explaining her situation, explaining that she had herself been placed through the agency under a misunderstanding, that the situation had resolved itself happily, but that she wished to ensure the agency understood the kind of care that needed to be taken with the women who came through them. The women who were alone and frightened, and making the best decisions available to them with what they had. She did not know whether the letter would do any good. She sent it anyway, because doing nothing about things that troubled you was not something she was constitutionally capable of. She received, 3 weeks later, a long and thoughtful response from the woman who ran the agency, a Mrs. Caroline Albright, who wrote that she appreciated the letter deeply, and that she would like very much to correspond with Mrs. Ralston further on the subject of better practices, as she had herself long felt the existing procedures were insufficient for the welfare of the women involved. They did correspond further over several years, a thoughtful exchange between two women who both understood that a system which moved vulnerable people toward unknown situations deserved to be made more careful and more honest. Nothing about this exchange was dramatic or fast or visible to the world in any particular way. It was the kind of work that gets done quietly, in letters, by women who have jobs and children and households, and do the other thing on the side because someone has to and they happen to be in a position to. But it was real and it was something, and Sallie valued the reality of small somethings highly. In the autumn of 1886, James Ralston started school in Caldwell under the instruction of Miss Marsh, who was by now a fixture of the community, and who had a brisk competence with children that James immediately identified and decided to test, and who identified James immediately as a child who would require clear and consistent firmness, which she provided and which he respected. He came home on the first Friday full of information about geography and the causes of rain and the names of all the states, delivered at speed in the manner of someone who had been holding this in all week. Eleanor, watching her brother's performance over supper, said that she wanted to go to school immediately and could not understand why she had to wait until she was 6. "Because 6 is the rule," Sallie said. "I do not agree with that rule," Eleanor said. "I know you do not," Sallie said. "You may disagree with it all the way until your 6th birthday." Lionel, from behind his coffee cup, said nothing, because some conversations were Sallie's to conduct and he knew which ones they were. Eleanor started school on the first day of the semester following her 6th birthday and was apparently, according to Miss Marsh's letter to Sallie, the most prepared student she had ever received, which was gratifying and also slightly alarming, and which Miss Marsh was well equipped to handle. The winter of 1887 was the hardest in Sallie's memory on the ranch, a sustained and brutal cold that began in November and did not release until April, with a blizzard in January that kept everyone inside for 6 days and buried the barn roof nearly to its ridge. It was the winter that Anita had described years before, the personal kind of cold, the kind that got inside the walls and asked difficult questions. 2 of the Ralston horses died despite everything that could be done, and Wilson lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite on the second night of the blizzard before they got him inside, an event that happened fast and changed things permanently for a young man who had been entirely whole the day before. Sallie managed the household through that winter with a grim competence, keeping the temperature high enough, the food sufficient, the children manageable, Wilson's injury properly treated and healing as well as it could heal, and herself upright and functional when what she sometimes wanted was to sit down and put her head in her hands and wait for spring. She did not do that. She got up every morning and banked the fires and made breakfast and did what needed to be done. Lionel, who had gone through hard winters before and knew what they asked of people, watched her through that season and did not offer comfort she had not asked for, because she was not a woman who needed false comfort, but was present and capable beside her every day in a way that was itself a form of profound support. On the first genuinely warm day in April, he found her standing in the kitchen garden looking at the first green shoots coming up through the soil, the ground cracked and brave, insisting on spring. He came and stood beside her. "We made it," she said. "We did," he said. "Wilson is going to need a different kind of work," she said. "I have been thinking about it. He is good with numbers and with organization. The books for the ranch, I handle them, but there is more to manage now. He could learn to handle that in some of the buying and selling negotiation. He is bright enough. I thought the same thing, Lionel said. I was going to speak to him this week. I will speak to him, she said. I think he will hear it better from me. He looked at her. Why? Because he feels ashamed, she said. About the fingers, he thinks it makes him less useful. He needs to hear from someone outside the immediate sympathy of his employer that there are things he can do that are needed. I can say that without it sounding like charity. Lionel was quiet for a moment. You are right, he said. She did speak to Wilson, and he did hear it better from her. And over the next 2 years, he developed into the person who managed most of the financial and administrative side of the Ralston Ranch operation, with a capability that freed Lionel to focus on the horse breeding and cattle management, and freed Sallie for the household and the garden and the children, and the continuing correspondence with Mrs. Albright, and the various other threads of a life that had expanded beyond anything the frightened woman with the carpetbag could have imagined. In the spring of 1889, Sallie realized she was expecting again. She was 34 now, and she and Lionel had talked honestly about whether their family was complete with James and Alina, and had arrived at no firm conclusion in either direction, which was, it turned out, a conclusion of its own kind. She told him in the way she always told him things, directly and in the morning at the kitchen table, with coffee in front of them both. He received it the way he received most things of consequence, with a stillness and then a warmth that moved through his whole expression. Are you all right? He said first. I am fine, she said. It is different at 34 than at 24. But I am strong and healthy, and Anita will come when the time is right. I am glad, he said. You are not worried. I am a little worried, he said honestly, but I am more glad than worried. She reached across the table and touched his hand. Good, she said. That is the right balance. The third Ralston child was born in December, a boy again, and they named him Henry after Pastor Hendricks, who had married them 11 years before, and who had become, over those years, something closer to a family friend than merely the man who had performed their ceremony. Pastor Hendricks was deeply moved by the honor. In the quiet way he was moved by things he felt sincerely, and his wife Martha cried again, which everyone had come to expect and appreciate. Henry was a different kind of child from the beginning, quieter than James, less imperious than Alina, with a watchful quality and a particular gift for being content, which was perhaps the rarest gift of all. He watched the world with interest from the beginning and seemed to find it satisfactory, which pleased everyone. James, at 9, received his new brother with the grave seriousness of a boy who has thought about this and decided it is something he can accommodate. Alina, at 7, undertook the immediate project of educating Henry about everything she considered important, which was everything, and which Henry received with equanimity from the beginning, suggesting he had already assessed the situation and found his sister's enthusiasm worth tolerating. The years from 1889 forward were good years, years of deepening rather than expanding, years in which the things that had been built and planted were sending their roots further down. The ranch was established, profitable in the honest, solid way of operations built on good land and real skill and consistent work. The horses that came out of the Ralston operation were sought after. The community around Caldwell knew the Ralstons as people who kept their word, paid their debts, helped their neighbors, and expected the same in return, and were not going to be moved from their land by anyone or anything. Sallie and Lionel celebrated their 10th anniversary in September of 1888, before Henry was born, in the way they celebrated most things that were privately significant without ceremony for its own sake, but with a kind of deliberate acknowledgement of what the day was. They rode out together in the afternoon on the horses they had been riding for years now, Sallie on a black mare named Dusk that she had helped train from a yearling, and came to a place on the east side of the ranch where the land opened up, and you could see for miles in 3 directions, the sky enormous and the grass long and late summer gold. They stopped there, and Lionel looked out over the land and then looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there are things between two people after 10 years of honest life together that are not adequately served by sentences. Then he said, "I am glad you were on that stage." "I am glad you brought 2 horses," she said. He smiled, that same not large smile she had first seen on the boardwalk in Caldwell, the one that meant something was confirmed that he already knew. "Did you think I would not notice, that you were different?" "I hoped you might not," she admitted, "and I hoped you would. I was not entirely rational about it." "You were terrified," he said, not unkindly. "I was," she said. "You were not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A practical man who wanted a housekeeper with legal standing," she said. "What I found was someone who had read my letters closely enough to know I was sad and was kind about it before he knew anything else." "I read all the letters," he said. "I know," she said. "That was the thing." He reached over and took her hand the way he always had, carefully, and the Kansas afternoon laid itself out around them in gold and blue, and Sallie Winslow Ralston felt the full and unqualified weight of being in the right place and knowing it, which is a rarer thing than almost anything else the world offers. In 1893, when the financial panic that ran through the rest of the country drove cattle prices down and made life difficult for ranchers across the plains, the Ralston Ranch weathered it with the resilience of an operation that had been run carefully for 15 years. They drew in, spent less, sold what needed selling and kept what needed keeping, and came through the worst of it without catastrophic loss. Other operations around them were not so fortunate, and Sallie and Lionel did what they could for neighbors in difficulty, which was not everything and was not nothing. James was 13 that year, already riding with the hands and already demonstrating the combination of his father's steady judgment and his mother's quick thinking that made him very good with horses and even better with people. He was going to be fine. Sallie had known it for years, but 1893 confirmed it. A boy who knew how to work hard and help his neighbor without being asked was going to be fine. Eleanor was 11 and was in the middle of becoming someone very specific, a young woman who was going to have strong views about how the world ought to be run and who was going to express those views with complete precision and absolutely no apology. Miss Marsh sent Sallie a note at the end of the school year saying that Eleanor was the most intellectually engaged student she had ever taught and also the most argumentative, in what was clearly intended as a compliment. Sallie read it and showed it to Lionel, and they both recognized it. Henry was 4 and was teaching himself to read by looking over Eleanor's shoulder at her books, which Eleanor had noticed, and was managing with a proprietary patience that was the closest thing to unconditional generosity she currently possessed. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1895, all 5 of them were in the front room of the Ralston house, Lionel reading a farm report, Sallie hemming a dress for Eleanor who had grown 3 inches in the past year with no apparent intention of stopping, James doing his schoolwork at the table with the focused reluctance of a 16-year-old who has better things to do, Eleanor reading with Henry in the corner under the window. The cottonwood trees outside were in their autumn gold, and the light through the windows was the color of the month, and everything in the room was particular and ordinary, and full of the specific weight of lives being lived. Sallie looked up from her hemming and looked at each of them in turn, James bent over his paper, Eleanor pointing something out to Henry, who was nodding gravely, Lionel in his chair with the late afternoon light on his face. And she felt it again, that thing she had first felt standing in Lionel's kitchen on the first day she arrived, the thing that had felt like the world might contain more kindness than she had recently been given reason to believe. It was not just kindness. It was larger than that. It was the accumulated weight of 15 years of a real life, a life that had started with a lie she had told out of desperation and had become, through honesty and work and the daily practice of paying attention to one another, something she would not have traded for anything in the world. She looked over at Lionel and found him already looking at her, the way he sometimes did, the way that after 15 years still had the quality of being seen clearly by someone who is paying actual attention. He gave her that small, confirming smile, and she gave it back, and that was everything. She put down her hemming and went to the kitchen to start supper, and through the window above the sink she could see the last of the October light on the Kansas plain, gold and wide and endlessly itself. And she thought about the carpetbag with the wrong name on it, and about the woman who had stood on a boardwalk in the August heat wearing her sister's identity like a borrowed coat, and about a man who had looked at her and asked her real name instead. She thought about the moment the word yes had felt wrong in her mouth, and the moment immediately after when he had said, "What is your real name?" She thought about all the years between that question and this kitchen, all the winters and springs and cattle seasons and letters and children and disagreements and resolutions and quiet evenings and hard mornings, all of it between that question and this moment of golden light over the Kansas plain. She thought about Dorothea, who had wanted this life, and who had not gotten it. She held that thought with the tenderness she always held it with the love that does not diminish because its object is gone but finds different ways to exist. And then she thought, Sallie Winslow. My name is Sallie Winslow, and I have made a life worth the name. She started supper, and from the front room she could hear James arguing quietly with himself about his schoolwork, and Alina explaining something to Henry with great certainty, and Lionel's voice asking James a question about what he was working on, James's voice answering it. And then laughter, her husband's laugh and her son's laugh together in the same room, in the house that they had all made real by living in it. The supper bell was the big iron triangle that had been on the Ralston porch since before she arrived, and she rang it as the sun finished going down over the flat horizon of the Kansas plains, and the light went out of the October sky, and the stars began coming on one by one, and her family came to the table. They said grace. Lionel said it, as he always did, briefly and sincerely, a man who had his own arrangement with God and kept it personal. And they passed the dishes around, and the children talked about their days, and James said something that made Alina object strenuously, and Henry observed the argument with the expression of a small scholar taking notes for future reference. Lionel caught Sally's eye across the table and she caught his, and in the look between them was everything that did not need to be said, the whole of it, from the boardwalk in Caldwell to this table on this October night and all the years between, the good ones and the hard ones and the ordinary magnificent ones, the whole of a life built on one honest question asked in the August heat of a Kansas afternoon. What is your real name? Sallie Ralston. That was her real name now, in the fullest possible sense. A name that was entirely and completely her own, earned and chosen and held. A name that was not borrowed from anyone, but had been made by living it every day for 15 years in the company of a man who had wanted to know her true self from the very beginning, and had spent every year since being glad he asked. She took the serving dish her son passed her and put food on her daughter's plate because Alina was talking and had forgotten, and she looked around the table at the faces she loved most in the world, and the Kansas night outside was full of stars that had been there long before any of them and would be there long after, and the house was warm, and the supper was good, and Sallie Ralston was home.